Buddy. Do a quick shout out, Christy Miner. I see you there. There's another BCI staffer, which is on the call, and she's going to be doing a talk at the next WVNT meeting. So should go just for that. Anyway, yeah. So this is kind of a rehashing of some of the stuff I talked about back in February 2024. Feels like a while ago. But it's also sort of an update too, and kind of lessons learned along the way as we sort of continue with our programming. And so I'm going to start. Okay. I wanted to kind of give you all an overview. If you're not familiar with Bat Conservation International, I wanted to let you know who we are and kind of give you a sense of where we started and how we've kind of ended up where we are now on our journey of kind of trying to diversify who we reach and how we reach people with engagement and outreach about bats. So we were founded over 40 years ago now in Austin, Texas. They had just rebuilt the Congress Avenue Bridge, had accidentally made it an amazing bat habitat. There's about 1.5 million bats there. They moved in, everyone freaked out. It was sort of this like perfect storm of human bat conflict. And so the people who started BCI thought it would be the perfect place to kind of begin sort of changing hearts and minds and really challenging people's perspective on bats. We did that a lot of different ways, but it was very much outreach focused, kind of education focused. We have a lot of very cute bat photos so people can kind of see them up close, see that they were actually very adorable, not scary at all, and then really talking about why they were important to our ecosystem and to the planet. As we've gotten bigger, we started in 1982. Many years later, we have about, I think, 70 full-time staff now, and that might be more than that. I'm actually not sure. It changes constantly. We keep adding people. We have a very large staff, and we're located all over the country. We also have staff in different parts of the world. So we're truly an international organization. We do a lot of conservation projects and science research projects kind of in different parts of the world as well. So we have a much larger scope and scale than when we started out. But we're still obviously working to change hearts and minds about bats. I think things have shifted since the 80s and how people feel, but there's still a lot of people out there that maybe don't feel or don't have good associations with bats. So we're always working on that. That's a lot of my job. But basically now our mission is we want to end bat extinctions worldwide. So it's a very lofty goal. It's a very big goal, but that's kind of what we're all about. So with this thought, we're an international organization. We need a large scale, engagement and outreach program. And so that's where this Bat Walks program was conceived in 2019. So this is when I started at BCI. I had my 6-year anniversary in August, which is wild. But I was hired to kind of run this Bat Walks program. And this was really our first attempt at really trying to reach a lot of people in kind of a new way. So this started with a survey to the members, people who joined BCI as a member. Shelly Plant is a member, I just learned, which is awesome. Thank you. But we asked our members, what was it that made you join BCI? Like, what was it that made you want to support bats and bat conservation? And so many of them had like a specific story, an experience that they had that was a positive experience about bats. A lot of them, they've been to Bracken or they've seen like a large, colony emergence somewhere in the country. They've been to Costa Rica and saw, a bunch of bats. Or I just feel like a lot of people, and I found this too when I go out and do outreach, people want to share their bat stories, which is really cool. So it seems like, there's sort of an emotional component that really makes kind of this idea, the sense of stewardship stick with people. And so we realized, we want people to have positive bat experiences because that seems to be what drives them to really want to be long-term supporters of bats and bat conservation. So how do we do this? How do we create bat experiences for as many people as possible? So the idea was bat walks. Basically, we wanted to bring bats to everybody. Bats are everywhere. They're in every single state. They're in every continent except Antarctica. So bats truly are everywhere, and I think a lot of people don't realize that. And this handy dandy device, the Echometer Touch 2, the technology was kind of ready for this program. If you don't have one of these, they're really, really fun, especially if you're, a nature nerd, which I'm suspecting many of us are. Thumbs up for that. This actually plugs into a phone or a tablet, and it lets you hear the bats' calls. You can hear their ultrasonic echolocation calls, which you normally can't hear with our sad little human ears. but it also identifies what bat you're probably hearing. So it's really a game changer in terms of kind of outreach and education for bats. So it really brings bats to people in a new way. And we wanted to do bat walks and kind of teach people about bats on these bat walks. We didn't have the staff, so the Bat Walks program was really about working with organizations that were already doing nature tourism. So, places like zoos and nature centers, and training them to kind of do bat walks, giving them the equipment they needed to do a bat walk, and having them incorporate it into their programming. So that was the idea behind the program. And this is kind of where we started in 2019. It very much was a growth mindset. We wanted to reach as many people as possible and really try to kind of bring in as many, new bat advocates and bat enthusiasts as we could. We had to really use these partnerships because again, we didn't have the staff to do these bat walks on our own. So we really had to kind of think about this from a partnership mindset and really think about, how we could have the largest impact using these partners because if we're training, this is people from the San Antonio Zoo in this picture. A lot of our initial work was in Texas. That was kind of where our funding was coming from. So we went to, I think, 4 or 5 cities in Texas. We worked a bit in Florida as well. But the San Antonio Zoo does bat walks. I'm not sure if they still do. I think they do. But yeah, they're reaching all these constituents. They're already built in constituent base that they're doing kind of spreading this message about bats, which is really, really wonderful. And it's very metrics driven. So we're trying to get big numbers. But basically for BCI, we go to a place, for example, we went to Miami. We had a training at Zoo Miami, invited a bunch of like partners that were kind of from nature centers and other kind of similar organizations, did 1 day training, and then we left. And that was kind of how it worked. And we had big dreams and big goals. And I think you know where this is going. COVID hit shortly after this program started. I made this, I think, in December of 2019. We were rolling, we were planning, we had very big dreams. And so this was sort of what we were trying to do. We were planning to train, 1,000 bat ambassadors across the United States, 500 partnerships, and reach, over 30,000 people through these bat walks. And that was kind of where it all was. And then COVID happened. The bat wants you to know it's not his fault. It's not bat's fault. I'm sure you guys know. They don't know yet still what caused or what animal kind of started the COVID pandemic, but they think it was probably, I think, a pangolin or a raccoon dog, which if you don't know what that is, Google it. They're very cute. But anyway, not directly from a bat anyway. But with COVID, this program very much relied on people interfacing face to face. It was how it worked. And so we had to really kind of rethink everything. Also, our funding was coming from a zoo, and they had to shut their doors and lost a huge percentage of their income because a lot of that was from ticket sales. So unfortunately, they had to pull their funding as well. So we lost our funding for this program. We had to kind of rethink how we were doing things. So, in a way, it was obviously a very stressful time, as I know many of you are dealing with the same thing. Kind of a crazy time to be doing wildlife viewing and nature tourism. But it gave us a chance to really rethink. We had time. We were all at home. We had time to think. We wanted to think about, is there a way we could do this better? Is there a way we could do this differently? Is there a way we could sort of benefit people as well as bats? And like, what does that look like? So we really just as an organization really are committed to making the places that we work, the places where we are better, for people as well as bats, because a lot of the things that bats need benefit people as well. So that was something we really are committed to as an organization. And, we wanted to work more in communities, have kind of, more in-depth connections, more lasting connections, really building these partnerships, building trust within these communities, expanding our constituent base, reaching people that maybe we haven't reached before because we haven't really thought outside the box. One of the issues with this is that BCI is a large scale organization. And if you're working in communities, each community is different and unique. They're not all the same. So you really have to kind of work on a small scale to have, significant impact. And that was challenging because we want to have a big impact. We also had to really check ourselves, like, what can we do? What are we the experts of? Obviously, we're the bat people. That's what we do. That's what we do all day. That is what we know. So we had to make sure we kept reminding ourselves of, we had to stick to our mission, stick to our goals. We didn't want to have scope creep in terms of what we were doing, and really just, wanting to do all these things, but making sure it's within the lens of bat conservation. And then, within this, realizing if we're working with communities, there's going to be things that we don't know, things that we don't understand. There's going to be gaps, where again, we're kind of the bat people, and we don't really do other things. So we really realized early on that this is going to be very partnership heavy if we wanted to have a significant impact on people. And so we kind of started from scratch and really asked ourselves, okay, like what would this look like? What would this be? And again, this was during COVID. We had a lot of time to think about it. So the first thing we did was a design brief, which is just kind of a document that, and there's a lot of different people have different ways of organizing their thoughts and kind of creating different documents to use when they're designing programs, things like that. This is one of the ways. There are many ways. But for us, it really helped us sort of hone in on what we were trying to achieve and kind of what we were trying to do and really help us focus. And so we really just wanted to engage people in with bat conservation, with bats, in a way that also benefits communities as well. And really trying to figure out, what does that look like? How do we do it? And so we were like, okay, let's do a pilot. I believe it was 2021 at this point, and things were kind of opening up again. And we were like, let's do a pilot. Let's try to figure this out. We wanted to make sure that we didn't bite off more than we could chew for the pilot. So we're like, let's just focus on one location, one partner, see if this works, see if what we're doing makes sense. Again, we had to kind of figure out partnerships because, BCI works everywhere, but part of the issue with that is if we're going to a specific city, they may not know us there. So it's really important to seek out partnerships where our missions were overlapping to kind of help us understand the places where we were working. And so we thought about where should we go? Well, we started in Austin. I live and work in Austin, and it seemed like we had a lot of kind of knowledge of the city, a lot of partners that we knew that were lovely and wonderful that we had worked with or would like to work with. And so for the pilot, we went to Austin, Texas. Yay. And it was convenient because I didn't have to go anywhere, which is great, especially back then. And the first thing we did, and this is something I will recommend forever and ever, because this was probably one of the best things that came out of all of this, was this idea of a listening session. And BCI did not make this up. Like, obviously, this isn't something that's existed for a long time, and lots of people. There's lots of resources out there if you wanted to do this. But we basically approached a couple of different partners, nonprofit partners or organizations in Austin, and just wanted to talk to them. We really wanted to make sure we didn't go in with an agenda. We just really wanted to talk to them, introduce ourselves. Some of these orgs we had worked with before, or they had heard of us, but some of them hadn't. And we really wanted to understand, what was their mission and goals, like who were their constituents, what were the barriers that they faced towards reaching their mission and goals, and like, would bat conservation, bat education, would any of that fit into what they were doing in an organic way? Because we didn't want to force it. Obviously, we don't want to force ourselves on people. We want to work in like this lovely kind of partnership where everybody is kind of doing something that makes sense, and we both benefit from the partnership. So we did do a bunch of listening sessions in the beginning just to get feedback from these different groups while we were trying to sort of identify a partner for the pilot. And from the listening sessions, we learned some interesting things. Most organizations were super excited. Actually, all of them were excited to talk to us. Austin, not shockingly, is a very bat-friendly city. And, even if the orgs hadn't worked with us before, they were like, oh my God, you're the bat people. We love bats. Bats are awesome. And so that was great. I don't think that was necessarily representative of what might happen in other places that perhaps are not so batty. But it was nice to see that like what we were doing, they already perceived it as having value, which was really cool. We also, realized that, each of these groups, we all work in the same city, but they're all working with different constituents. And that's something to really think about, what level of kind of partnership are you working on? Like, are you working in Austin? Are you trying to work with like specific groups in Austin, a specific part of town? So it's really kind of figuring out that scale and sort of what makes sense is really important. We also realized our programming has to be flexible. What we were doing, what would work for Latino Outdoors, wouldn't necessarily work for another organization. We also talked to Embrace Race, which is an LGBTQ uh, kind of umbrella organization for a lot of different those types of interest groups in Austin. And so, like, what we would do with them would look really different probably from what we would do with some of the other groups. So it's just important to kind of be flexible and allow ourselves to be creative. We also realize, again, we are just the bat people. So we might have, big plans and big dreams and big ideas, but at the end of the day, it has to align to our mission to make sense for BCI to be involved. So we just have to understand that we are sort of limited in our offering. Also limited in the sense that, we have a small budget and pretty much every organization, especially right now, is hampered by funding limitations, and that's sometimes a lot of the orgs would say that was one of the main barriers to achieving their goals. So unfortunately we couldn't come with a bunch of money, and we just wanted to acknowledge that kind of straight up. That was sort of where we were at. I wish we had more money, don't we all? And also, like, we really just needed to invest time in relationships and build trust. Even though we've been in Austin for, 40 years around at this point, over 40 years now, some of these organizations had never heard of us, hadn't talked to us. A lot of their constituents had never heard of us. So, and that's probably in a city where BCI has been around for a long time. So just acknowledging that people aren't going to want to work with you, they don't know you, and it really it takes time to build trust, and that's a really important part of sort of all this work. Okay, so we ended up working with Austin Youth River Watch. They are a nonprofit that's been in Austin for a very long time, since 1991. They work with kids, mainly kind of high school age kids, generally from kind of underserved areas of Austin. They teach them about a bunch of different sort of environmental topics. They do a lot of outdoor activities. One of the things that's really cool is they actually pay the kids stipends to come and join their programming. So some of these kids, they have to get a job normally to support their family. They're able to come to Austin Youth River Watch and support their family through that stipend. They have such an amazing, uh, such amazing roots in the communities where they work. A lot of the river watchers that I met, like, their parents had been river watchers back in the day, which was really amazing to have kind of that generational buy-in for them. And they just do really great work. So they kind of were the partner that had the most bandwidth to accommodate a pilot with us. And also our missions overlapped in a very kind of natural way. So it seemed like a good fit for the pilot. So this is back at, 2022. This is a while ago. Kind of wild how time flies. But yeah, so we did this in 2022. We wanted to make sure that we collected metrics and kind of tried to track what we were doing and try to understand if what we were doing, was working, if it made sense, what were we trying to do, what were we trying to achieve. And we also wanted to make sure we took time to evaluate everything after the fact, because that often happens, with when you're working in a job where there's lots of things going on, you kind of finish something and move on to the next thing. And it's hard sometimes to take that space for evaluation. So we wanted to make sure that we could do that. So the first thing we really did was just talk to them, starting in January of 2022, just really chat with staff about, what would make sense for what, where could we fit into their programming that would be a helpful thing for them and where we would bring them value. And so, they do STEM education for, high school age kids. So bats and bat walks seem like a really good fit for that. They had kind of like a little garden in the back of their headquarters in Southeast Austin, and they were very interested in maybe expanding that and making that something that the kids could use. So a back garden, we have a back garden program that seemed like a great fit. They all wanted to go Bracken, which I get. Bracken is amazing and not too far from Austin, largest bat colony in the world. So that was something we talked about too. And then one thing I really wanted to see if we could do, and we ended up being able to do this, was we were able to cover the stipends for the kids while they were kind of doing bat related activities for the most part. So that was a really great way for us to kind of show Austin Youth River Watch that we were, we wanted to be an equal partner. We wanted to, like, bring as much value to what we were doing as we could, and just really, take some of the pressure off of them, to fund these the stipends for, a week or two. And so it wasn't like a ton of money, but it was something, and it made a difference. And I think it really strengthened the partnership. And I'm really glad we could be able to do that. Okay. So the first thing we did, we had like our own little mini bat week. This is in the summer. Real bat week is obviously in October, but we did our own bat week, and it was me kind of working with their summer programming, working with the kids. So we did, bat talks. We had Austin Bat Refuge came with their bats. They brought some bats, so the kids got to see bats up close, which was amazing. We also did like a bat hike. We did some other sort of activities too. We taught them how to use bat detectors. Yeah, so it was like a bunch of different things. We were sort of trying a bunch of things and seeing how it all went. It was really fun. We also had the kids draw bats too. A lot of the kids were really artistic and were excited to kind of express themselves creatively. So they did all these kind of amazing drawings that I still absolutely love. They're really, really talented and very cute, the drawings. And then we took them to Bracken. So they do field trips. They do 2 field trips as part of their summer programming, and the kids get to pick kind of which field trip they go on. And so the Bracken trip was after our Bat Week programming, and post that programming, a lot of the kids switched their field trip from wherever they were going to, I forget what the other one was, but a lot of them switched to Bracken, which was exciting. So they were very like into bats, I think, at this point, and really wanted to see Bracken Cave. So that was a really, really fun day. And then one thing we realized too, after talking to the kids and talking to staff at Austin Youth Riverwatch, is that even though these kids are from Austin and have grown up in Austin their whole lives, a lot of them had never seen the bats at Congress Avenue Bridge. And I realized working in Austin more and more, this is definitely a common thing. Like, downtown isn't exactly accessible to everybody. Parking is very expensive. Austin has some public transportation, but it's not great. And it's just like a challenging place sometimes. So we wanted to make sure that these kids got to experience their bats, and really kind of identify with these bats that live in the city just like they do. So we ended up renting a boat and having them go out on like a boat ride on Lady Bird Lake, and they got to see the bats, which was really, really fun, and they had a good time. And this girl here, she wore her bat ears, which I loved. And then I'm going to play this video. This is us planting the bat garden. So we did this in the fall of 2022. And we wanted to make sure that the kids were involved and they planted pretty much everything. We had a landscape architect, a local architect, help us design the garden, but we wanted to make sure that the kids did all the planting, so it was like their garden and they had that sense of kind of ownership over it. And so half the garden is veggies, which is what you're seeing here. They're planting a lot of veggies. And then there's a bunch of native plants to support the insects that our bats are eating. So this was just the best day ever. I'm saying if you're sad, like go to a planting event, plant some plants with people in your community, and it's just like all the good feels. So this was a really exciting way to sort of finish our partnership with them. And actually we got to oh wait, I'll talk about that more in a second, but the Back Garden Project actually was featured on Central Texas Gardener, which if you're not from Texas, this means nothing probably, but it's a big show on PBS that I love. And so they actually came out, they filmed us planting the back garden. They did a blog about it. I think this QR code still works, so you can go and check it out. And that was really exciting. The kids got to be on camera, they got to be interviewed, and I think they got a real kick out of that. Okay, going back. So we gave the kids a survey before we did all of our programming, just to sort of gauge where they were at in terms of how they thought about and felt about bats. And then we gave them a survey at the end to kind of see where they were at after everything that we did. And we found that, a majority of kids, a lot of them kind of began to think that bats were more important and relevant to their lives and to, the environment and the ecosystem. And then the one that I love the most was, most of the kids answered this. In the beginning, they were like, I don't know if bats are important to my community. I don't know if they're in my community. And then after this, the majority of the kids were saying, absolutely, they're important. And yes, there are bats in my neighborhood. So it showed that they were connecting bats to their own neighborhoods, to their own community. And that was really, really exciting. So, I'm glad that we captured these metrics, and I hope that we keep doing this because I think it's really powerful to kind of have this data to show. And so after the pilot, as I said, we wanted to assess. So we took some time. We still have a lot to learn. I feel like, I'm 2025, several years into this, still learning. And it's important, I think, for you to always be in a learning space with community work, right? Because we're not the experts, and that's okay. But we did kind of start to develop a process for how this would work. And I think that was really important. And I think, developing the process for the listening sessions and for partner identification and all of that was really valuable and has continued to prove to be valuable. One thing we realize is we want to maintain these relationships. If you're going to go through all the kind of the process of building trust with, a partner or with a community, you don't want to just like do work for a year and leave, because that's kind of, not something that you would do if someone trusts you. So we wanted to make sure we budgeted and allowed for continued work with Austin Youth Riverwatch if that's something that they wanted for each year. And we still work with them today, actually. I talked to them yesterday about it, adding some new stuff to their garden, because shockingly, a lot of it has died because Texas weather is rough. But anyway, we're still working with them, and I think it's really important to maintain, our commitment to that partnership. And I think, one of the things we realized too, we did get some good metrics, but there's a lot of kind of work that can be done with this in terms of social science and measuring those types of things. And that's not expertise we have at BCI. And so this is still true. Unfortunately, we're still kind of trying to get help with just tracking metrics better, measuring metrics better, what those look like. We're great at BCI at measuring conservation metrics. Social science metrics, it gets a little more complicated. So that's something we're still figuring out, unfortunately. All right, so that was year one. Year two, 2023. I think looking forward to what we were going to do next, the pilot was great, but we don't really have any like active conservation projects or kind of conservation priorities in Austin. The Congress Avenue Bridge is a fantastic place where there's lots of bats, but we don't really do anything there. So we really want this work in the future, and we're still kind of figuring this out now to really align with where there's conservation need or conservation work with community need, and kind of this sweet spot in the middle is really where we want to show up and where it makes the most sense for BCI. So year two, we decided let's go south. Let's go to San Antonio. This is Bracken Cave, which hopefully, if you haven't been, please come and visit us. But it is the largest bat colony in the world. And BCI, we own the preserve, the land the cave is on. We have, bat flights that you can come and visit in the summer. But, this is a really, really important spot. And it's important that we want to maintain a engaged and supportive community. For example, in 2015, developers were trying to develop directly around Bracken, and there was a lot of kind of things that happened with that, but a huge part of it was the community being activated to support and kind of this grassroots efforts just to block that development. Thankfully, it didn't happen. BCA was able to buy that land, and now it is protected, around Bracken with help from the Nature Conservancy. So a good example of kind of why we want people in San Antonio to care about bats and to support bats. And so with this work, this community engagement work in San Antonio, I kind of think of it as two buckets. And I apologize, this is like the best clip art bucket I could find. You can get support across. But it's really kind of twofold. So the first part is really we want to expand our constituency, right? We're facing a lot of challenges with conservation as a whole, as y'all know. And we really need all hands on deck. We need everybody at the table, because we're kind of in an unprecedented time of challenges in conservation, and that goes for bat conservation too. So we really want to expand our constituency and also increase and expand our community support for bats in San Antonio. And that can happen a lot of different ways. We do a lot of tabling events, we do a lot of bat talks. And I should say, the staff and volunteers out at Bracken do all of this stuff in San Antonio. They've been doing it for a long time. And, we try to kind of do as much as we can, but you'll find if you go into San Antonio, even though we've been working there for a very long time and have been part of Bracken for a very long time, there's many people in San Antonio that don't know Bracken's there, have never been there, don't know that there's a ton of bats in San Antonio. Honestly, like you can walk anywhere at San Antonio at dusk in the summer and you'll probably see bats. It's very batty. But there's just a lot of people that don't realize it. And it's also, a rapidly growing city. It's a very large city, so there's just a lot of kind of work to be done there. And then the second kind of bucket here is we want to increase green space in these urban and suburban areas, which is really about increasing bat habitat. All of the bats, whether it's the bats at Bracken, the Mexican freetails, or there's about, I think, 6 or 7 other species that are in San Antonio, depending on the time of year. They're all eating insects. And so we really want to promote native plants to support the food that our bats are eating. And so with that, our bat garden program works really well for that because that's all about planting native plants for bats to support, a bat bug buffet, basically. Tree planting too. Bats eat a lot of moths. Nothing supports more moth species than oak trees and, other types of trees as well. But, trees are important larval host plants for a lot of moth species, and then they're also important for adults as well. They're also roosting habitat for certain bats too. And then I'll talk more about the idea of a food forest, but I love a food forest. It's kind of this amazing way to create habitat and then also provide food for people. So it kind of combines all the things into one beautiful little package. And I'll talk more about that in a sec. But this is sort of how we organize kind of our efforts in San Antonio. And then one thing we realized, I am not in San Antonio, and we have our Bracken people, but they're mainly at Bracken kind of there's so many people that come through Bracken. They are very busy out there. We really needed a community liaison in San Antonio. And I talked a little bit earlier about, building trust and how it takes time. And although, there are people in San Antonio, obviously, that have heard of us or at least have heard about Bracken Cave, there's a lot of work that we need to do still to kind of just have people know who we are. And so one thing that really helps sort of streamline this process is hiring somebody from the community to do the work. And so this is Cecile Parrish. She's our San Antonio liaison. And she, born and raised in San Antonio. She has a background in urban agriculture. She also is an entomologist and a beekeeper, but she's worked with a lot of different organizations. She's been living and working in San Antonio for a long time. And so we were really lucky to find her and to have her come on. She works part-time for us, but she is our community liaison. And I think, what we've learned is it really helps to have someone who understands the community, obviously doing this work. And this sounds very obvious, but it's just something that I think needs to be said and something at BCI maybe we didn't think of immediately. And it's great if you can hire somebody from within that community to kind of streamline some of the trust building that needs to happen to kind of start working. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the groups that we've been working with. I just want to be mindful of time, but I think I'm doing okay. One of the first groups we really approached is Latino Outdoors, and they are fantastic. I don't know if y'all are familiar with them or have worked with them. They do amazing work, and they're all about making nature and natural spaces more equitable, bringing people from the Latino community outside, kind of letting them experience a lot of different activities. And the San Antonio chapter is really active and really lovely. And so, we actually did talk to them. I don't know if you remember their logo was in the beginning for the listening sessions. We did talk to them back in Austin, and the Austin chapter wasn't as active, so it didn't make a ton of sense for us to partner with them at the time. But the San Antonio chapter is very active, and we've been working with them for a long time. So they've been coming out to Bracken for a really long time. This is Josie Gutierrez and Elaine Hernandez. Josie is the Texas Latino Outdoors program manager, and Elaine is the San Antonio program manager. They both are amazing people. But we've been able to do bat walks with them. We've been able to train actually some of their volunteer hike leaders too on like the bat walk technology. We were able to give them bat detectors, and they were able to kind of start offering bat walks as part of their own programming, which is really exciting because that's, I think, will have a big impact. This picture right here is actually from a recent program. So we just got a grant from Bikes for People, and we were able to work with B-Cycle, which are the bikes you can rent that have like the electric bikes, the e-bikes you can rent in San Antonio. They're in other cities as well. But we got a grant with San Antonio B-Cycle, Latino Outdoors, and us to put on this bike share and bats program. And it's been really fun. We basically are teaching, so B-Cycle teaching people how to use the bikes, and the bike share, they get a 1-year membership to B-Cycle. All the participants are from Latino Outdoors, so we brought them in to kind of do the class. And then we're also doing bat education as well. We actually had our last bike ride last night that Christy, who's on this call, was at. I was not, but it's been really fun, and it's kind of a creative way to teach people about bats and also support, a green way to get around, support biking, and kind of make biking and all of that stuff more equitable too. So it's been a really interesting way. And I will say, with each partnership, it's been really fun to be creative and try to think about creative ways that we can work together with these partners that now we've been working with for a couple of years and really grown to just love working with them and just looking for opportunities to kind of keep doing that. Another partner we have worked with a lot in the last few years is the San Antonio River Foundation. They are kind of the nonprofit arm of the San Antonio River Authority, and they do a lot of kind of different work in San Antonio, obviously mainly along the river. We actually, Josie Gutierrez, who was on the previous slide, she introduced me to Sarah Ramirez right here, who is the Director of Nature Equity and Engagement for the San Antonio River Foundation. Kind of reached out to them, started talking about ways we could maybe collaborate. They love bats, which was really cool, and they have kind of one of their main gems is this park called Confluence Park. There's just this massive pollinator garden there. It's just beautiful. There's a ton of bats there. The river's right there. So they were very excited we were excited to kind of figure out ways to collaborate, which has been really fun. They had several festivals. They had Cochineal, which is like Coachella, but cochineal, like the scales that are on the cactus plants. They had Cochineal, which is a big festival that we were able to be a sponsor, as well as kind of table and do some bat walks too. So that was kind of the first thing that we did with them. And this enabled us to reach so many new people that we hadn't potentially like interfaced with before as an organization. This past year, they had a pollinator tea party. That's what this picture is from, where it was very cute. It was such a fun event. It was for kids. They have this like building at Confluence Park that they transformed into the pollinator tea house, and the idea was for the kids to feel like an insect when they walked in. So they had an artist build these, she built a bat cage, she built giant flowers, she built giant birds, but it was all about sort of this experiential thing, trying to get kids excited about pollinators. And they could have tea in the little room, and we gave them a bunch of agave sticks to put in their teas, which was really fun. So that was a really fun event. We were able to co-sponsor that with them, and they did a lot of kind of bat education as part of that. We were able to table as part of that too. And then another part that this was the most exciting thing for me. I love art, and I think art is this amazing way to kind of emotionally connect people to nature and to conservation. You can talk to somebody, you can do a talk about bats all day long, but sometimes they just see art and it kind of clicks in a way that you can't really do in another way. So we had an artist, her name is Audrey Flores. She's right here. She's fantastic. You can follow her on Instagram. But she created a bat out of plant materials. So this is palm trees. These are agave leaves, little cactus pads for the nose and ears. This is red yucca flowers. And then the whole body was cenizo or Texas sage. And so all the plants used are sort of bat related. Obviously, that's pollinated agave, not in San Antonio, but they do pollinate agave. San Antonio has a ton of palm trees. Bats love to roost in the dead palm fronds, so that's where these came from. Cactus pads, bats pollinate a lot of cactus flowers. They also support moss, and that is true for the cenizo and the red yucca too. And so her whole idea as an artist was to have this sit out and kind of have people add flowers to it. And then it was meant to sort of stay out and decay over time and be an ephemeral art structure, which is really cool. And she named it Yerba Buena, which is the scientific name for one of the nectar bats. And she had the kind of information here on the sign, and it was a way we could kind of, BCI, we're not artists, we don't do this type of thing. But River Foundation was able to connect us to Audria, and we were able to sponsor her to make this amazing statue, which is really exciting. It's going to be featured in our Bats magazine, I think, next issue. And then the last partnership I wanted to tell you all about is the Temoctolone Food Forest. I know I mentioned food forests before, and I get really excited when I talk about them. Temoctolone Food Forest has existed for about, I think, 4 or 5 years now. It is truly a community-led project where it's land that the county owns. It's in Padre Park in San Antonio, if you're familiar with the area. But there's a couple, like the Food Policy Council of San Antonio is involved. There's a couple other nonprofits as well, but it really is very community driven. Every decision they make, they kind of have like a bunch of committees that kind of are involved in it. And, we were trying to find an inn on the Temoctolone Forest just because it seemed like a really great way to sort of support bats and people. And because Sarah Ramirez from the San Antonio River Foundation had worked with them and was involved in it, she introduced us to people at Temoctolone, and that helped us kind of get in. And then when we hired Cecile, she actually was part of this already, which really helped too. So it just shows you how all these partnerships sort of build on each other, and that trust sort of builds on each other as well. Tumaktalome is, as I said, it's a newer food forest, so the trees are still small, but they plant, there's pecans and mulberries and peaches and figs and a lot of other things that people can pick right there and eat. And they also have some other things growing as well. And then they have these berms and swales where we kind of made it our back garden. And we have these signs. You can see we've got everyone's logo on there. It's very exciting. But we were able to help plant part of the back garden there and add a bunch of plants that would support kind of the insects that bats are eating again. So it was a great way to support this project, that doesn't have consistent funding because it's a bunch of volunteers and community members coming together. But it's a really important project. They're really committed to teaching people about sustainable agriculture and then also making it a usable community space too. So this one, it was super, this is a great partnership that I love and I'm excited to see where it goes next. So I wanted to kind of, with my 5 minutes left, or I don't know, I don't want to take the whole hour. I give some time for questions, but I want to sort of bring it back a little bit and just talk about sort of what we've learned and kind of, again, why are we doing this? Because I think, that answer has sort of changed a little bit over the years, but I think there's parts of it that I think still very much ring true. So I think, obviously with conservation, we need community support and community buy-in. Like with bat conservation, obviously this means this is too, but like people aren't gonna support what you do. They don't know about it, if they don't feel strongly about it. And so we really need to engage people to get them excited about what we're doing and to hopefully get them to support what we're doing. I mentioned how the community rallied to save bracken. We had a similar example in Miami with the Florida bonneted bat, where they were going to build a water park on what was very important foraging habitat for the bonneted bat. It's the most endangered bat in the United States. It was the Miami Wild Water Park. And the community just rallied in this amazing way with lots of help from local partners in Miami, and BCI was involved too. We were not the only ones. There was many people involved, but we were able to stop the development of that water park, which was huge because at the beginning of it, it didn't seem like that was possible. And so, as development continues, as our wildlife is kind of more under threat from different ways, having that grassroots support is so powerful to kind of make things happen that seem impossible. If it was BCI on our own fighting to, preserve the land around Bracken or fighting to stop Miami wilds, like we wouldn't have been able to do it. So it's really important to have as many supporters and community, people involved that we can. Also, I think, just fundamentally, we want to make places better where we work. I think we have the power to do that, again, within the lens of bat conservation, but we can do this if we work in a more intentional and thoughtful way. So I think as an organization, we feel really strongly about that. It also gives us new opportunities. Just a small example is that art project that I was telling you about in San Antonio. Like we never would have done that on our own. We don't know how to do that, but this partnership created this really fun opportunity to do something different. And it was something that I think, we were really excited about, and it got a lot of positive feedback from people who saw it at Confluence Park. And then long term, we're not going to be everywhere forever, and staff can change sometimes at BCI, but, we want the conservation work that we do to be sustainable. We want it to last. And the thing that's going to make it last is having people in the communities where that work has happened or is happening involved and supportive. So it's really important, I think, long term to do this work to make sure what we do matters in 10, 20, 30 years because, things are challenging and we just want to make sure that what we're doing lasts, I guess. Sorry, not super articulate, but I feel like you get what I'm saying. Okay, so these are my main takeaways, and I'm done, I promise. I think it's important to listen and meet people where they are. And all of these are very obvious, but I'm just going to say them anyway because I think it's important to sort of put them all down in one place. But as I said, the listening sessions have been fantastic, and I recommend, going out and doing that if it makes sense for your organization and what you do, just to sort of get to know your partners, get to know the people around you, the organizations around you, the communities around you, and also acknowledging that like if you have a space where you want people to visit, maybe you have to go to where they are before they come to where you are. And I think meet people where they are also means if you're working with maybe sometimes a more controversial taxa like bats, not everyone loves bats, which is shocking because they're amazing. But yeah, I think for us it's acknowledging that there's some fear and there's some misinformation out there, and really just, starting understanding that that's where people are and being okay with it and just trying to kind of move them forward in a gentle way, always a gentle way. And for the listening sessions and when you're learning, I think it's also really important to leave your agenda at the door. As I said, we went into the listening sessions really with just a sense of curiosity and trying to understand our partners instead of sort of going in and telling them, like, this is what we do. Do you want this? Like, we really wanted to understand and make sure that they felt like they have been heard and kind of validate their mission and their challenges and everything. So I think it's important when and honestly with any conversation in life to just be curious and to really listen and not just wait for other people to stop talking, right? Nobody ever does that. I never do that. I talked a lot about building trust, and I can't emphasize how important this is. You saw in San Antonio how our programming has just kind of exponentially grown as we build that trust. So building trust opens new opportunities. It lets people know that you are, a committed partner and you're going to show up in a specific way where people feel good about. And I think, it's something that is really important. And a guy we used to work with, a consultant, used to say, conservation moves at the speed of trust, which I love because I think it kind of applies to a lot of different aspects of conservation work. This one was big for us too. Again, we are the bat people. We don't do, everything. So just kind of reminding yourself that it's okay that you can't kind of do all the things and you don't, just setting clear expectations with partners about, what you can and can't do and just being honest, I think is really important. And just, you know, at the end of the day, we're the bat people and we're going to talk about bats and we're going to, try to encourage more support for bat conservation and for our work. But that doesn't mean we can't work with partners that have a different mission in a creative way. It's just kind of thinking about it outside the box. I love this picture, a little snail with the bat wings. And this work really does take time. Like the San Antonio work, we've been out there at Bracken for a very long time. And then we started doing more in-depth community engagement work, I'd say in 2022. And it's 2025 now. So it's been years of work and years of just showing up, really. Building trust takes time and you kind of have to account for that. Sometimes you don't have a lot of time and that's obviously has to be okay too. So just figuring out what you can do and the amount of time you have is important. And then also just recognizing that, that working with people is slower and sometimes you just have to allow for that, slow building of trust. And honestly, so much of it is just showing up, right? Just being there, being a known entity. When you can, it's important to empower shared decision making. This doesn't always work, but I will say, having people at the table and letting them feel validated and heard, and if they can be involved in decision making, where you can both, you know, both be involved, I think that's really powerful because people obviously are going to be more invested when they feel like they're a part of it. And I think this, this doesn't always work, but I do think it's kind of a good rule of thumb to incorporate this when you can. And then I always put this one in because I feel like we're all terrified of failing. And failing doesn't feel good, but it's important to recognize that it happens because we're human, right? And at the end of the day, we're not perfect. And I think that's okay. I think it's a beautiful thing. And I think, our bringing our humanity to this work is very powerful, right? I think like we can appeal to people. We have to appeal to people because the wildlife can't, right? Like they're not out there, they can't talk to people, they can't communicate. So we're sort of their liaisons in a way. And we can appeal to people's humanity by using our own humanity, which is really powerful. Obviously, like big failures versus small failures, it depends on where you work, it depends on how your superiors feel about that. But I do think it's important to leave space for failure and to just make sure that, if something doesn't work or doesn't go the way you want, it's okay to say, okay, that didn't work. Like, what can I learn from this? Right? Because failure is a place of learning. If someone never failed, they never learned anything. I think that's an Einstein quote, possibly. Don't check that. But yeah, I think it's a place where you can learn. And it's important to acknowledge that, this is a space where we're all learning, and that's fine. And then the last one, and this is hard, but I think, when we do this work, we really want to acknowledge that everyone's time is valuable. And if you can compensate people for their time, that's great. I know a lot of us rely on volunteers probably too heavily because of, budget limitations and there's not much we can do about that. But I do think, it's important to at least recognize, and I know everyone does a lot of amazing volunteer recognition, which is fantastic, but I think, down the road, I love the idea of compensating more volunteers for their actual time because, they're doing a lot and it amounts to a large, dollar amount and value. And I think it's just something that we want to make sure we recognize. And also understanding too that, a lot of people probably want to volunteer, but they can't. They're working, they don't have the space for it. So if we are able to compensate people for their time, we might be able to bring in new people that maybe, that was a barrier to them volunteering or joining and supporting before. So just something to think about. Okay, that's all I got. Happy to take questions. This is my email. Feel free to reach out. But yeah, I'll take questions if we've got any.
Thanks, Erin. I did
Yeah.
realize I didn't introduce myself at the top of the hour. I am Shelley Plant. I chair the Wildlife Viewing and Nature Tourism Working Group, and that's why I introduced Erin. But yeah, we have about 5 minutes. If any questions, I did change my background to be more batty.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I will say too, if any of you have like stories you'd like to share where you're doing this type of work or kind of had successes or challenges, like I'd love to hear that too. I'm not
Everyone's quiet.
so quiet. I don't know if that's good or bad.
Well, I know there are people on this call that do work with bats and wildlife viewing. They are just feeling shy. All right, going, going. Any questions? Well, thank you. That was amazing. I saw this presentation at the Wildlife Viewing Academy, and now I feel like I learned more. Now there's a question
Yay!
here. Thanks for great info. Where do you suggest starting to look for community organizations to partner with?
That's a great question. I think, it can be you can do a lot of different things. Sometimes it's literally like a Google search. It's just like on a map looking for sort of like nonprofits that are in the area. And it depends on where you're working. And like, if you're in a city, there's a lot of options. Obviously, there's lots of places you can go. I mean, I think, it's the easiest thing is to kind of look for other organizations in your area where there is some mission overlap or mission alignment. So, if it's an environmental organization or a conservation organization or even just like educational STEM, like we do a lot of work in Austin with a group called Girl Start. And they're all about like bringing STEM education to girls. And so that's kind of fit really well into that programming. And so it wasn't like an obvious first partnership idea, but then it suddenly made a ton of sense. So I think there's a lot of different ways to look at it, and you have to kind of figure out, you know, does it make sense for your mission? And sometimes, honestly, it's just reaching out and talking to people or asking around as well, too. I mean, I think depending on where you're working, people are probably partnering already, and it's sort of just figuring out, who's doing what. Hopefully, that's helpful.
This is a great follow-up question. Can you share a little more about the conversations you held with the community? Did you prepare questions or let everything just flow organically?
Yeah, we actually did for our listening sessions. We did have a standard set of questions that we asked, that we developed, and it was only about 5 or 6 questions, and like they were mainly kind of like and we were mainly talking to staff from the organizations that we were talking to, and we were just asking them, obviously we looked at your website and we kind of know a little bit about you, but we want to hear from your words, like what is your mission? What are your kind of main goals? Like and then we ask kind of like, what are the barriers that you face in achieving those things? And then like, who are your constituents? What are their main priorities? Because I think that's really important to understand as well. And then we sort of ask them like kind of, what they hope for the next 5 years for their organization to try to get a sense of like, where they're thinking in terms of like looking forward. And if there's ways that like, maybe there's some way that it makes sense to kind of like connect in that way down the road. And then, the last questions were sort of like, you know, this is who we are, this is what we do. Do you think that there's any way this could make sense in terms of what y'all do? And like, is there a way that there might be overlap? And just being really honest and kind of trying to be humble about it and just being like, we're trying to learn and grow and work with different partners. So we really would just love your input on this and just kind of leaving it open. But I mean, I think the questions can be a lot of different things, but I think you really just want to try to understand the organization and like what they're dealing with and kind of what their main goals are and then who they're working with as well.
All right. Well, that's the top of the hour. So thank you so much, Erin. I appreciate your time. I'm going to turn off the rec-
Thanks, Ellie.
Oh, how do we turn off the recording?